To the world, Victor Haynes is a savior. To me, Eris Thorne, 32 years old, he's the monster who destroyed my family. He stole my father's entire life's work, threw my family out on the street, and left him to die in disgrace, forgotten by the world. But in his arrogance, he made a fatal mistake. He left my father's undeniable signature right in the vaccine's formula, a ticking time bomb that will cause the immune systems of millions to turn on their own bodies months later. He believed that once my father was dead, all his crimes would be buried with him. But he never imagined that the legacy he stole wasn't just proof of his crime. It was also the only key to saving millions of lives, and the weapon I will use to carve my father's name back into history. My father was Professor Elias Thorne. When I was a girl, people used to tell me that he was a genius. He was a geneticist who believed that science could change the world, not just in theory, but in practice. I did not have bedtime stories about castles or glass slippers. My bedtime stories were about DNA strands twisting like staircases, about how the instructions for life were written in a code of 4 letters. He would sit on the edge of my bed and hold my small hand in his. He would say, "Eris, remember this, you carry a library inside your body, and that library is what makes you you." I was too young to fully understand, but I knew one thing. My father made me feel like the universe was something I could reach out and touch. Being a girl who adored her father meant that I followed him everywhere. If he went down to the basement to sort through lab notes, I sat beside him with a flashlight. If he scribbled equations on napkins, I tried to copy them in my childish handwriting. My friends at school played with dolls and dreamed of being actresses or singers. I dreamed of pipettes and microscopes. My father never told me that science was a man's world. He told me science belonged to anyone brave enough to ask questions. He would smile and say, "You're going to grow up and do more than I ever did." He believed in me long before I knew how to believe in myself, but even at a young age, I saw the other side. I saw the way he came home sometimes with his face drawn tight, his shoulders slumped like he carried a mountain. I heard him whisper the name Victor Haynes with bitterness. At first I thought Victor was just another scientist, but soon I realized he was the man who betrayed my father. My father had shared his research too freely, believing in collaboration. Victor took those ideas, claimed them as his own, and whispered lies that destroyed my father's credibility. The men in suits believed Victor. They stopped inviting my father to conferences. They stopped approving his grants. Suddenly, the man I saw as larger than life was treated like a fraud. I was just a girl, but I knew humiliation when I saw it. I remember walking home from school and hearing 2 neighbors gossiping in their yard. One said, "Did you hear about that Thorne fellow? Apparently he faked his results." The other shook her head and said, "Shame for his little girl." That little girl was me. I kept walking with my backpack digging into my shoulders, pretending not to hear. But I heard. And the words carved themselves into me. As money dried up, we lost our house. We moved into a small apartment with peeling paint and thin walls. I did my homework at a kitchen table surrounded by stacks of my father's notebooks. He guarded those boxes like they were gold. He told me, "Eris, inside here is the cure to diseases the world is not ready to solve. Inside here is proof that I was right." I believed him. Even when classmates laughed at my second-hand clothes, even when my mother cried quietly at night over bills, I believed him. I clung to his certainty because it was all I had. When I was 16, my father's health began to fail. He coughed constantly. His hands trembled when he tried to hold a pen. He refused many treatments, partly because we could not afford them, partly because he did not trust the pharmaceutical companies that had stolen his work. I remember sitting beside his bed one night, brushing his hair back from his forehead. He looked at me with eyes full of both love and sorrow. He said, "Eris, promise me you will not let them erase us. Promise me that if you choose this path you will walk it as a woman who cannot be silenced." I held his hand and promised. I was a girl, but in that moment I became something else. I became a daughter carrying a torch. He passed away when I was 20. I was a college student studying biology, and I buried him with a fury burning in my chest. At the funeral, people spoke softly about what a shame it was, how talented he had been, how tragic his fall had been. I wanted to scream that it was not a fall, it was a theft. They stole his name, his work, his health, and then they buried him in silence. I walked away from that grave with a vow carved deeper than bone. I would not let his ghost fade. So here I am now, a woman standing in a white coat with my name embroidered over my chest pocket. Dr. Eris Thorne. Every day I badge into the Institute with pride. And every day I carry fear. Pride because I have earned a place in a world that once destroyed my father. Fear, because I know how ruthless this world can be. My colleagues see me as driven, maybe too intense, but they do not know the story behind my eyes. They do not know that I am not just running experiments. I am chasing justice for a man who gave me everything. I am not alone in this place. There is Dr. Maya Lark, my closest friend. She is loud and unfiltered, the kind of woman who throws her hair up in a messy bun, gulps coffee, and says what everyone else is too polite to say. She keeps me grounded. She tells me when I am obsessing too much, when I need to breathe. There is Professor Adler, my supervisor, older with weary eyes. He once knew my father. He does not talk about it much, but sometimes I catch guilt flickering across his face. Maybe he regrets not defending my father. Maybe he sees him in me. And then there is Evan Cole, a journalist who always seems to be poking around. He asks about the ethics of big pharma, about hidden scandals. He can be annoying, but he reminds me that the truth still matters to someone outside the lab. Outside of work, my life is quiet. I live alone in a modest apartment. I cook simple meals. I do not date often because I do not trust easily. At night, I sometimes pull out the fireproof box under my bed. Inside are my father's old notebooks. The pages are stained and yellow, the handwriting uneven, but when I trace the words with my fingers, I feel like I can still hear his voice. Those notebooks are my inheritance. They are not money or property. They are whispers of discoveries the world has not yet seen. This city is alive with ambition. Skyscrapers gleam in the sun, cars honk, sirens wail. I ride the train past glass towers that house men like Victor Haynes. I wonder if he ever thinks about the girl he left behind when he stole her father's work. I wonder if he imagines that girl grew up, put on a white coat, and is still coming for the truth. I wonder if he ever loses sleep. I doubt it. Men like him rarely do, but I do. At night I dream of my father. Sometimes he is on a stage, finally applauded. Sometimes he is coughing blood, whispering that he failed. I wake up with sweat on my neck and tears in my eyes. People tell me to let go. But I cannot, because I am not just any scientist. I am a daughter who watched her father be erased, and I refuse to let the erasure be permanent. So this is where my story begins, with a man who gave me curiosity and courage, and with a woman who refuses to forget him. My name is Eris Thorne. I am a scientist. I am a daughter. And this is the beginning of the fight I was born into. I grew up in the shadow of what happened to my father, and even though years have passed, the shadow never really left me. It followed me into every classroom, every exam, every lab bench. It was there when I walked across the stage to accept my PhD diploma. It was there when I introduced myself as Dr. Eris Thorne and saw people pause for half a second, as if my last name carried a faint echo of scandal. I knew some of them had heard of Elias Thorne. They might not have known the details, but they remembered enough to whisper. And even if they never said a word to me, I could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing on my chest. When I was younger, I thought I could outrun it. I thought if I studied harder, if I earned perfect grades, if I stayed in the lab until dawn, maybe I could silence the whispers. I wanted to prove that I was more than just Elias Thorne's daughter. I wanted to prove that I deserved my place. But the truth is I never outran the shadow. I carried it with me, like a tattoo burned into my skin. Some days it made me stronger. Other days it made me feel like an imposter living on borrowed time. At the Institute, my work demanded focus, but memories found their way in at the strangest times. I would be pipetting samples into a tray, and suddenly I would remember the night my father sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I would be analyzing gene sequences on the computer, and suddenly I would hear his voice whispering that the truth has a way of surviving. The past was always close enough that I could feel it breathing down my neck. Maya noticed it before anyone else. She and I had been sharing lab space for almost 2 years, and she had a way of watching me that made me feel both exposed and safe at the same time. One night after we finished running a long set of experiments, she tossed her gloves in the biohazard bin and leaned against the counter. She said, "Eris, you ever going to tell me why you work like the world will end tomorrow if you stop?" I laughed it off at first. I said, maybe I just like science more than normal people. But she crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Do not give me that," she said. "I see the way you look at those old notes you bring in sometimes. I see the way you freeze when people mention HelixCorp. This is not just about loving science. You are chasing something." Her words unsettled me because they were true, but I was not ready to share the whole story. Not yet. So I told her pieces. I told her my father was once a scientist who lost everything. I told her I wanted to prove that our family name still meant something. She studied me for a long moment, then she sighed. She said, "Whatever it is you are chasing, I hope when you catch it, it does not break you." Then she walked away, leaving me with my thoughts. That is the thing about Maya. She never pushes too hard, but she never lets me hide either. Professor Adler was different. He did not ask me questions directly, but sometimes in faculty meetings, his eyes lingered on me longer than on anyone else. I knew he had been around when my father's reputation collapsed. He had survived by staying quiet, by not taking sides. I do not blame him, not entirely. In academia, silence is often the safest choice. But part of me wanted to shake him and ask why he never spoke up, why he let Victor Haynes poison everything. Of course, I never did. Instead, I watched him from across the table, searching for some sign that he carried the same guilt that haunted me. Sometimes I thought I saw it, but he never said a word. Then there was Evan Cole. He was not a scientist. He was a journalist, a tall man with sharp eyes and a notebook always sticking out of his bag. He had a habit of showing up at odd hours, hanging around the lobby, asking researchers questions about new projects. Most people ignored him or brushed him off, but sometimes I found myself talking to him. Maybe it was because he was persistent. Maybe it was because he did not treat me like just another name on a research paper. He treated me like a person. One afternoon, as I walked out of the building, he fell into step beside me. He said, "Eris, do you ever think about the way corporations control science?" I said, "All the time." He smiled as if that answer was all the invitation he needed. He told me about stories he was chasing, about corruption in drug trials, about patents that kept life-saving medicine locked away from the poor. I listened, part of me skeptical, part of me intrigued. He said, "One day I want to write about the people who still fight for the truth." Then he looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, like maybe he already thought I was one of those people. The truth is, I was torn. Part of me wanted to bury the past, to live quietly, to do my work and collect my paycheck and never stir up the kind of storm that killed my father. But another part of me burned with anger. Every time I saw the name Helix Corp in a journal or a news article, the anger flared. They were one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and guess who their star executive was? Victor Haynes. The man who had destroyed my father was now celebrated as a pioneer. His face appeared on magazine covers. He gave keynote speeches at international conferences. He wore tailored suits and smiled for cameras. And every time I saw him, I felt the weight of my father's ghost pressing harder against me. I remember one particular evening. I was in my apartment flipping channels when a news segment came on. There was Victor shaking hands with world leaders announcing a new research initiative. He spoke with confidence, with charm. The reporter called him a visionary. My hands clenched into fists. I wanted to throw the remote at the screen. I whispered to myself, "Liar." I whispered, "Thief." Then I turned off the television and sat in the dark for a long time. In that silence, I heard my father's cough, his tired voice saying, "Eris, promise me," and I knew I could not stay silent forever. But the shadow of the past was complicated. It was not just anger. It was also doubt. What if people were right to believe Victor? What if my father really had cut corners, really had made mistakes? I hated myself for even thinking it, but late at night the questions crept in. And those questions tore at me because I had built my identity on defending him. If he had been wrong, then who was I? Some nights I stared at his notebooks, searching for mistakes, searching for confirmation that he was the man I remembered. I never found anything that convinced me he was a fraud. If anything, his notes were meticulous, almost painfully careful. But the doubt lingered, like a splinter under my skin. The shadow also affected how I saw myself as a woman in science. I knew the world judged me differently. Some people looked at me and saw only my last name. Others looked at me and saw a young woman trying to play in a man's field. I carried both judgments, and sometimes they weighed heavier than the pipettes in my hand. But there were moments when I felt powerful too. Moments when I stood at the bench, my hair tied back, my gloves snug, the centrifuge humming, and I thought, I belong here. Not because of my father, not despite him, but because I earned it. Those moments kept me going. I also knew that my father's story had carved my path in ways I could not escape. If he had been celebrated, maybe I would have grown up carefree. Maybe I would have chosen another career. But because he was destroyed, I became determined. Because he was silenced, I became loud in my own quiet way. Because he was erased, I became a record keeper of everything he left behind. The shadow shaped me, and I learned to live with it, even when it threatened to swallow me whole. Looking back, I think the shadow was both my curse and my compass. It haunted me, but it also pointed me toward what mattered. It told me that truth mattered more than comfort, that courage mattered more than reputation. It told me that if I wanted to honor my father, I could not just hide in the lab and run safe experiments. I had to be ready to step into the fire when the time came. I did not know when that time would be. I did not know what shape it would take. But deep down, I felt it coming, like thunder rolling in the distance. The past was not done with me yet. The shadow was only the beginning. My life at the Institute had fallen into a rhythm that most people would probably find unbearable, but to me, it was all I knew. The mornings started early, usually before the sun had even cleared the skyline. My alarm would go off at 5:30, and I would roll out of bed with the same dull ache in my muscles that came from too many nights of short sleep. I would tie my hair up into a messy bun, splash cold water on my face, and pull on jeans and a sweater before shrugging into my lab coat. Breakfast was almost always an afterthought, usually a piece of toast I ate standing at the counter with a cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint. By the time I left my apartment, the city was just starting to stir. Delivery trucks roared down the streets, and the sidewalks filled with people clutching paper cups, their eyes still heavy with sleep. The subway ride to the Institute was a world of its own. I would sit wedged between strangers, watching their faces lit up by the glow of their phones. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the dark window, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes always looked tired, and there were faint lines beginning to carve themselves around my mouth. I was only 32, but years of stress had left their mark. Still, every time the train pulled up to the stop near the Institute, something inside me straightened. The moment I swiped my badge and pushed through the glass doors, I felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because I had earned the right to be here. Dread because I knew what this world was capable of doing to people like my father. Inside, the Institute was a maze of white walls, polished floors, and the constant hum of machines. The air smelled like ethanol, disinfectant, and sometimes burnt coffee from the break room. My lab bench was covered in neatly labeled vials, stacks of papers, and the occasional coffee mug I forgot to wash. It was chaotic, but it was my chaos. I often joked to Maya that if someone cleaned it up, I would never find anything again. She would roll her eyes and tell me that organized chaos was still chaos, but she never touched my space. Maya was my closest friend, though calling her just a friend felt too simple. She was like a sister, a partner in crime, and sometimes a thorn in my side when she nagged me about eating or sleeping. She had this wild energy about her, like she carried her own storm cloud everywhere she went. Her hair was always tied up haphazardly, strands falling in every direction, and she wore sneakers that squeaked on the lab floor. She had a way of calling me out that no one else dared to try. One evening, after a 12-hour shift, I was still hunched over the microscope when she came up behind me and flicked the back of my head. I jerked up, nearly dropping my pen. She said, "Eris, you look like a raccoon that crawled out of a trash can. Go home before you collapse." I glared at her, but she just grinned and handed me a sandwich she had grabbed from the cafeteria. That was Maya, annoying and caring all at once. Professor Adler was a different presence altogether. He was older, with gray hair that always seemed slightly out of place, like he had run his hand through it 100 times during the day. His office was filled with shelves of books that smelled faintly of dust, and his desk was covered in papers stacked so high they looked ready to topple. He spoke softly, with the measured patience of someone who had lived through many battles. He asked about my projects, offered advice, and occasionally slipped in comments that hinted at his memories of my father. Once, when I was frustrated about a failed experiment, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Your father had the same fire in his eyes when things went wrong. He never quit either." I froze, my throat tightening, but he quickly changed the subject. He rarely mentioned my father directly, but the shadow of that past was always between us. Evan Cole was the wild card in my life. He was not a scientist. He was a journalist who seemed to live on caffeine and curiosity. He had a habit of showing up unannounced, scribbling in his notebook while pestering researchers with questions about their projects. Most people found him irritating, but I found him strangely compelling. He was relentless in a way that reminded me of my father. One afternoon, I ran into him outside the Institute. He leaned against a wall, smoking a cigarette even though the sign above his head clearly forbade it. He smirked when he saw me and said, "Rules are just suggestions, right?" I rolled my eyes and told him he was going to get kicked out one day. He shrugged and said, "Probably, but until then, I am going to keep digging." He flicked ash onto the ground and lowered his voice. "You ever wonder how many shortcuts corporations take when nobody is watching?" I looked at him carefully and said, "More than anyone wants to admit." He gave me a smile that was half approval, half challenge. I walked away unsettled, but I could not shake the feeling that he saw through me. Life moved in that strange rhythm until the whispers began. At first, it was just small talk in the labs, a handful of unexplained respiratory cases overseas, doctors who could not figure out why patients were not responding to normal treatments. I skimmed articles online but did not pay much attention. Viruses appear all the time, most flare up and fade away. But then the numbers grew, dozens became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. And suddenly, what had been a whisper turned into a shout that no one could ignore. The institute shifted overnight. Emails from the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization poured in. Meetings were called at odd hours. Research teams that had been focused on completely different fields were suddenly told to redirect their efforts. The hum of the sequencing machines grew constant, day and night. Samples arrived from hospitals across the country. Everyone moved with a sense of urgency that was both exhilarating and terrifying. We all knew something big was happening, but none of us could fully grasp the scale. I remember sitting in the break room with Maya one evening. The television mounted on the wall showed footage of crowded hospitals overseas, doctors in protective suits, and patients gasping for air. The anchor spoke calmly, but the fear was written all over the images. Maya muttered, "This feels like the start of something terrible." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. I whispered, "We are not ready for this." She looked at me and said, "Are we ever ready for something like this?" I did not answer because the truth scared me too much. As the days went on, the virus spread faster than anyone expected. The words outbreak, emergency, and crisis appeared in bold letters across newspapers and news websites. Schools closed. Flights were canceled. Stores ran out of masks and disinfectants. I walked through the city and felt the fear in the air. People avoided each other on the subway. Strangers wore gloves and scarves pulled up over their faces. The city that had always buzzed with life suddenly felt muted, like everyone was holding their breath. Inside the lab, we pushed ourselves harder. Sleep became optional. Meals were forgotten. Everyone was running on adrenaline and caffeine. I volunteered for every shift, every project. Part of me wanted to help, but part of me also felt like I had no choice. Fate was pulling me forward, whispering that this was the moment everything in my life had been leading to. The shadow of my father's story pressed heavier on my shoulders. He had warned about rushing science, about letting greed drive discovery. And here we were, standing on the edge of disaster, with corporations already circling like vultures. Then came the announcement that made my blood run cold. Helix Corp, the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, declared that they were close to developing a revolutionary vaccine. Reporters called it groundbreaking. Politicians hailed it as salvation. Stock markets surged. And there on the stage, smiling confidently as if the world belonged to him, was Victor Haynes. His face older now, his hair silver at the temples, but his eyes still sharp and cold. The man who had destroyed my father was now being celebrated as the hero who might save humanity. I stood frozen in front of the television in the break room. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I barely noticed. Maya glanced at me, her eyes widening. "Eris, are you okay?" I forced myself to nod, but my voice cracked as I whispered, "That man is not who they think he is." She frowned, confused, but I could not bring myself to explain. How could I tell her that the man being hailed as a savior was the same man who had stolen my father's work, who had left him to die in obscurity? I turned away from the screen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The past and the present had collided in a way I could no longer ignore. The ghost of my father was no longer just a shadow. It was standing right in front of me, demanding to be heard. And deep down, I knew my life was about to change forever. When Helix Corp made their announcement, the world erupted with a kind of desperate relief I had never witnessed before. It was as if people everywhere had been holding their breath for weeks, waiting for something, anything, that resembled salvation. The evening news looped the same footage over and over again. Crowds outside Helix Corp headquarters in New York City, reporters shouting questions, Victor Haynes standing at a podium with polished confidence, telling the world that his company was weeks away from delivering the vaccine that would change everything. His voice was steady, his smile reassuring, and his words carried the weight of certainty people were starving for. I sat on the couch in my apartment with the television flickering in the dim light. Outside my window, the city was unnervingly quiet. Usually by 8 o'clock, the streets below would still be alive with cars, music drifting from open windows, laughter from bars. But now the sidewalks were nearly empty. The pandemic had changed the rhythm of life in ways that felt unreal. Watching Victor's face on the screen, I felt anger burn in my chest so strong it made me shake. He was standing there as the savior of mankind, and the world was eating out of his hand. No one knew that the man behind that smile had once destroyed another scientist's life. No one but me. The next morning, the institute was buzzing. People in the hallways whispered about the announcement, their voices full of hope. I overheard one researcher say, "If Helix Corp really has this, maybe we can turn the corner." Another replied, "If they do, it will be the greatest medical achievement of our generation." They sounded excited, relieved, almost grateful. I wanted to shout at them to tell them that Victor Haynes was not a visionary, that he was a thief. But the words stuck in my throat. I could not prove anything yet. All I had were memories and my father's notebooks locked in a box under my bed. In the lab, Maya cornered me. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her eyes sharp. She said, "What was that reaction yesterday when you saw him on TV? You looked like you had seen a ghost." I swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. I muttered, "I just do not trust that man." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you know him?" The silence stretched between us until she finally sighed. "Eris, I am your friend. You can tell me things." But I shook my head. Not yet. I could not drag her into this storm until I was sure of what I was dealing with. She studied me for a long moment before finally letting it drop, but I could tell she did not believe my evasive answers. Professor Adler called a meeting that afternoon. The faculty crowded into the conference room, all of us seated in chairs that squeaked on the polished floor. The air buzzed with tension. Adler stood at the front, his glasses perched low on his nose, a thick folder in his hands. He cleared his throat and said, "As you all know, Helix Corp has made an announcement that has captured the world's attention. We are not here to debate their claims. We are here to decide how our institute will respond." His voice was calm, but I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. He went on about redirecting resources, about potential collaborations, about the importance of staying grounded in facts. But I barely heard him. My mind kept replaying Victor's face, that smug expression, the way the cameras adored him. After the meeting, I lingered in the hallway. Evan Cole was there, leaning against the wall with his ever-present notebook. He grinned when he saw me. He said, "Quite a show, huh?" I frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" He tapped his notebook with his pen. "Helix Corp swooping in as humanity's savior. It is almost too good to be true." He lowered his voice, which usually means it is. I stared at him, surprised by how casually he voiced the suspicion I had been choking on. "Do you have proof?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not yet, but I am good at sniffing out stories, and this one smells rot." He gave me a pointed look. "And you look like someone who knows more than you are saying." I opened my mouth to respond, but then I closed it again. I was not ready to let him in. Not yet. The days that followed were surreal. The media could not get enough of Helix Corp. Every news outlet ran endless segments about their breakthrough. Victor Haynes appeared on late-night talk shows, his charm on full display. He spoke about hope, about science rising to the occasion, about the brilliance of his team. He looked directly into the camera and told families that soon they could stop being afraid. People wanted to believe him. They clung to his words like a lifeline. Social media exploded with hashtags praising Helix Corp. Photos of Victor's speeches spread across the internet, his face becoming a symbol of salvation. Meanwhile, hospitals overflowed. The virus tore through communities, leaving devastation in its wake. I saw it on the subway, in the anxious eyes of passengers who sat apart, clutching bottles of sanitizer. I saw it at the grocery store, shelves stripped bare of basics. I saw it in the lines outside testing centers, people shivering in the cold, waiting hours for a swab. And every time I saw Victor's face on a billboard or on the news, I felt my blood boil. How could the world worship him while my father lay in a grave, forgotten, erased? One night, I pulled out my father's notebooks. I spread them across my kitchen table, pages filled with his handwriting, equations, and sketches of molecular structures. My chest tightened as I traced the ink with my fingers. So much of his work had been ahead of its time. So much had been ignored or stolen. I whispered to the empty room, "They do not know who really deserves the credit. They never knew." The silence pressed back against me, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in years, I cried openly, my tears smearing the edges of the paper. The next day, I returned to the lab with swollen eyes hidden behind safety goggles. Maya noticed, of course. She always noticed. She pulled me aside and said quietly, "Whatever this is, you do not have to carry it alone." I looked at her, torn between trust and fear. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I am fine." She did not push, but the look she gave me said she knew I was lying. Helix Corp's rise only grew louder. They released carefully edited videos of their labs, gleaming spaces filled with smiling scientists in crisp coats. They published flashy press releases full of big words that impressed the public but meant little to experts. And yet, the experts mostly stayed quiet. Fear and hope made strange bedfellows. No one wanted to be the one to question the company that might end the nightmare. No one but me, because I knew Victor, I knew what he was capable of, and deep down, I knew something about all of this was wrong. Every night, the same thought gnawed at me. If Victor had stolen from my father once, what was stopping him from doing it again? And if this vaccine really was built on lies, then millions of lives were at risk. I could not prove it yet, but the unease in my gut grew stronger with every passing day. The shadow of my father's past was no longer just a memory. It was alive, looming, demanding that I act. And I knew, sooner or later, I would have to step out of silence and into the fire. The week after Helix Corp's announcement felt like a blur. Every news channel, every newspaper, every social media feed seemed to revolve around them. It was impossible to escape. Even the walls of the institute echoed with their name. Colleagues whispered about potential collaborations, about what it would mean if Helix Corp really succeeded. Some spoke with admiration, others with envy. Everyone wanted to believe in a miracle. Everyone except me. I buried myself in my own work, partly to stay busy, partly to keep from exploding every time I saw Victor's smug face on a screen. Our institute had been tasked with analyzing raw viral data provided by international agencies. It was tedious, exhausting work, but it mattered. We were tracing mutations, mapping how the virus spread, identifying possible weak points. The kind of work that did not make headlines but was essential for any real vaccine. I spent hours staring at code scrolling across my monitor, my eyes burning, my shoulders stiff. I told myself I was doing my part to help, but deep down I knew I was also hiding from the storm raging outside. Then something strange happened. One night, long after most people had gone home, I was still at my desk, nursing a cold cup of coffee. The lab was silent except for the low hum of the machines. I was combing through data that Helix Corp had released to the public, supposedly to showcase their progress. Most people glanced at it and moved on, but I studied every line like my life depended on it. That was when I saw it. A sequence, a notation, something so small that most eyes would have skipped over it. But I knew it. I knew it because I had seen it before. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned closer to the screen, double-checking. It was there. A pattern, a shorthand, a signature of sorts, my father's signature. He had developed that specific notation years ago, a way of marking structural variations in genetic models. It was unique to him. I remembered him scribbling it in the margins of his notebooks when I was a girl, explaining how it made the data easier to follow. I had never seen anyone else use it, and now here it was, hidden in Helix Corp's data. For a moment, the lab seemed to tilt around me. I grabbed the edge of the desk, my breath coming fast. Memories crashed into me all at once. My father hunched over papers, his handwriting quick and messy. His voice tells me that the truth always survives. His cough, his weary smile, his promise that one day I would see. And now here it was, proof that his work had not just survived but had been stolen once again. I sat back in my chair, shaking. Anger flared hot and sharp, but beneath it was something else. Fear. If Helix Corp had stolen from my father's research again, what did that mean about the vaccine they were building? What corners had they cut? What truths were they hiding? I knew I had to be careful. If I shouted this from the rooftops without proof, I would be dismissed as paranoid, as the bitter daughter of a disgraced scientist. I needed more. The next morning, I found Maya in the lab. She was hunched over a centrifuge, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail. I hesitated before speaking. Finally, I said, "Maya, can you look at something for me?" She glanced up, surprised by the seriousness in my voice. I showed her the data, pointed out the notation. She frowned, studying it carefully. After a long silence, she said, "Okay, so what am I looking at?" I swallowed. "That notation is unique. My father used it in his research. No one else did." She blinked at me. "Are you saying this data came from him?" I nodded slowly. She leaned back, processing. "Eris, that is a big accusation." I whispered, "I know, but I cannot ignore it." She studied me for a long time, then finally said, "If you're right, this changes everything." Later that day, I ran into Professor Adler in the hallway. He was carrying a stack of papers, his expression distracted. I stopped him and said, "Professor, can I ask you something?" He looked at me over his glasses. "Of course, Eris." I hesitated, then asked, "Did you ever see my father use a special notation for genetic variations?" His face froze for a fraction of a second, then softened. "Yes," he said quietly. He was very proud of it. "Why do you ask?" My chest tightened. I said, "I think I found it in Helix Corp's data." His eyes darkened, but he said nothing. After a long pause, he simply nodded and walked away. That silence told me more than words could. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about Victor standing on that stage, promising salvation. I thought about the world clinging to his words. And I thought about my father, buried in the cold ground, his work stolen again. Rage bubbled up inside me, but it was tangled with fear. If I exposed this, would anyone believe me? Would they say I was just imagining connections because of my family name? Would they bury me the way they buried him? The days that followed only deepened my unease. Helix Corp released more data, and I combed through every bit of it. The patterns were clear now. Not just one notation, but several. Entire sections of their methodology mirrored my father's unpublished work. I recognized equations, shortcuts, even phrases that echoed his exact words. It was like hearing his voice in the middle of their reports. Every discovery made my stomach twist tighter. This was no coincidence. They had stolen from him. Again. One evening, I invited Maya to my apartment. She sprawled on my couch, eating Chinese takeout straight from the box while I laid out my father's notebooks on the table. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. She compared them to the data on my laptop, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. Finally, she looked up at me. "Eris, this is undeniable. They copied this." She shook her head, almost in disbelief. "But how do we prove it to the world?" I pressed my hands to my face. "I do not know yet, but we have to try." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "Then I am with you. Whatever happens, I am not letting you do this alone." Her words steadied me, but the fear lingered. Because the more I dug, the more I realized how dangerous this truth could be. Helix Corp was not just a company. They were a giant with billions in resources, with politicians in their pockets, with lawyers who could crush me without breaking a sweat. And Victor Haynes was not just any man. He was ruthless. He had already destroyed one scientist's life. What would he do to me if I threatened his empire? Still, I could not stop. Every night I sat at my table, surrounded by my father's notebooks, piecing together the puzzle. His ghost was with me in every line of ink, every equation, every shorthand symbol. The echoes of his voice filled the room. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something huge, something terrifying. The clues were there, and they all pointed to the same truth. Helix Corp's miracle vaccine was not theirs at all. It was built on the bones of my father's work, and I was the only one who knew it. The nights at the institute had started to blur together. I lost track of how many evenings I stayed behind after everyone else went home, sitting alone in the fluorescent glow of the lab. The hum of the freezers and sequencers was the only company I had. Outside the windows, the city lights shimmered, but the streets were almost empty because of the virus. People were too afraid to gather, too afraid to breathe the same air. It felt like the world had gone silent, and inside the silence my mind refused to stop racing. I sat hunched over the computer, staring at protein models that stretched across the screen. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway, the bitterness grounding me. My eyes burned, but something deep in my gut told me to keep going. I had pulled Helix Corp's data apart piece by piece, line by line, cross-referencing everything with my father's notebooks. It was like trying to piece together a ghost. The deeper I went, the more I felt him with me, his handwriting scrawled in the margins of my memory, his voice whispering warnings about the dangers of rushing. That was when I saw it. At first it looked like nothing, just a small irregularity in the protein folding structure. Anyone else might have skimmed past it, assuming it was an error or a quirk of the model. But I stopped cold. My stomach twisted as recognition washed over me. I had seen this before. Years ago, I remembered flipping through one of my father's notebooks while he explained something I was too young to grasp. He had pointed at a diagram almost identical to the one glowing on my screen now. His notes in the margin had been clear. Potential instability. Dangerous if unchecked. My fingers shook as I scrolled through more data. The pattern repeated itself. A structural weakness that looked harmless at first but could unravel in the body months after exposure. I leaned back, my breath coming shallow. Oh God. If this vaccine was released as it was, millions of people would line up, desperate for protection. They would feel safe at first. They would hug their children again, return to their jobs, believe the nightmare was ending. And then, months later, their immune systems could turn on them. The body would not distinguish friend from foe. It would begin to destroy itself. I whispered into the empty lab, my voice breaking, "It is a time bomb." I sat frozen for a long time, my hands clutching the edge of the desk so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The weight of what I had just discovered pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had ever felt. My father had known. He had seen the same flaw years before. He had warned about it, had begun to work on a solution. And now here it was, repeating itself, ignored by the man who had stolen his work. Victor Haynes was racing toward the finish line with the world cheering him on, blind to the disaster waiting on the other side. When dawn finally came, I had not slept at all. The lab was quiet except for the sound of footsteps as the morning shift began trickling in. I dragged myself to the break room where Maya was pouring coffee into a chipped mug. She raised an eyebrow at me, her eyes narrowing as she took in my pale face. "Eris, you look like hell. Did you sleep at all last night?" I shook my head and shoved a folder toward her. "Look at this." She sighed, clearly expecting another one of my obsessive deep dives, but the moment she started flipping through the data, her expression changed. Her casual annoyance melted into shock. She looked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me this is not what I think it is." I nodded, my throat tight. "It is exactly what you think. Their vaccine has a fatal flaw. It will work at first, but months later it could trigger autoimmune collapse. This could kill people, Maya, not a few, millions." She stared at me for a long time, her hands trembling slightly as she set the folder down. "Jesus Christ. Eris, this is," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I leaned in, desperate. "We cannot let this happen. We need to gather proof, solid proof. If we go public now, they will destroy us before anyone listens. We have to be careful." Maya rubbed her forehead, pacing the small room. "Careful? Eris, you are telling me the world's biggest pharmaceutical company is about to roll out a vaccine that could wipe out entire populations. Careful does not feel like an option. We need to shout this from the rooftops." I grabbed her arm, my voice sharp. "And then what? They smear us as conspiracy theorists. They say I am just the bitter daughter of Elias Thorne. They bury the evidence, and the world never hears the truth until it is too late." "We cannot let that happen." She stopped pacing, her eyes locking on mine. "Then we find proof so solid that even they cannot bury it." Her words steadied me, but they also terrified me, because I knew exactly how dangerous it would be to dig deeper. That night, I walked home with my father's notebooks heavy in my bag. My apartment felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves knew I was carrying something dangerous. I spread the notebooks across the kitchen table, flipping through page after page until I found the entry I remembered. His handwriting slanted, tired but deliberate. "Instability identified. Possible solution, adjust protein expression pathway, delay immune trigger. Needs further testing." I pressed my hand over the words, my chest tightening. He had seen it. He had begun to solve it, but he had died before he could finish. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "You tried to save them, Dad. And now I have to do it for you." The next day, I called Evan. It felt reckless, but I needed someone outside the lab, someone who could think about the bigger picture. He met me in the park near the institute, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked tired, his notebook clutched in his hand as always. "You sounded urgent," he said, sliding onto the bench beside me. I handed him copies of the data, my hands trembling. "Read this." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. "If you are right, this is catastrophic, world-changing." I swallowed hard. "I am right." He studied me for a long moment. "Then you need to understand what this means. If you go public, they will come after you with everything they have. Helix Corp has lawyers, politicians, media connections. They will paint you as unstable, as obsessed, as the daughter of a disgraced scientist trying to drag down a genius out of spite." I felt my throat tighten. "You think I do not know that? They already destroyed my father. They could destroy me too, but if I stay silent, millions could suffer. How can I live with that?" He leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "Then you do not stay silent, but you also do not go in unprepared. You need irrefutable evidence. Enough that they cannot spin it, cannot bury it. Until then, you keep your head down. Promise me." I looked at him, anger and fear swirling inside me. "I cannot promise that. If the rollout happens too fast, people will die." His jaw tightened. "Then you better work faster." We sat in silence for a long time, the city sounds muffled by the weight of what hung between us. Finally, he closed the folder and handed it back. "Be careful, Eris. You are walking a dangerous line." The following weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Maya and I worked late every night, poring over simulations, checking and rechecking the data. She cursed loudly every time the flaw revealed itself again, undeniable and damning. At one point, she slammed her fist on the desk and shouted, "How can they not see this? How can an entire team of supposed experts miss something this glaring?" I rubbed my eyes, exhausted. Because they are blinded by the rush to be first. Because Victor Haynes does not care if people die as long as he is hailed as a savior. He did not care about my father. Why would he care about anyone else? She softened at the mention of my father, her voice gentler. "You think this is personal?" I looked at her, my eyes burning. "It has always been personal, but this time it is bigger than me, bigger than my father. This is about the world." Some nights, when I was too tired to think, I would lay my head on the desk and close my eyes. The hum of the machines became a lullaby. In those moments, I dreamed of my father. Sometimes he stood in the lab with me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. Sometimes he was back at the kitchen table, scribbling notes while I sat beside him with crayons. Sometimes he was in the hospital bed, whispering his last words. "Do not let them erase us." I would wake up with tears on my cheeks and go right back to work, because I knew what I had to do. The flaw was no longer just data on a screen. It was a countdown. Every press conference Helix Corp held, every headline praising them, every politician promising relief brought us closer to disaster. And I was the only one who could stop it. My father had left me the warning. He had left me the beginnings of the solution. It was up to me to carry it forward, to finish what he started. The truth was sitting in my hands, dangerous and undeniable. And I knew, with a clarity that chilled me, that keeping it secret was no longer an option. The world was walking straight into a trap, and I was the only one who saw it. I used to believe I could carry the truth alone. I told myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I just stared at the data long enough, if I just clung to my father's notebooks tightly enough, I could hold the world together by myself. But the night I saw the flaw and understood what it meant, that illusion shattered. I knew then that no single person could stop a machine as vast and ruthless as Helix Corp, and I knew that if I tried to do this alone, I would burn out or be buried, just like my father. The thought terrified me. Asking for help had never been easy. My father raised me to be self-reliant, but he had also taught me something else. He used to say, "Eris, science is not a solo act. Discovery only matters when it is shared, when people build on each other's shoulders." For years, I had carried the loneliness of his downfall like a scar, telling myself that trusting others was dangerous. But now, sitting in the glow of the lab lights with the truth gnawing at my chest, I knew he was right. I needed a circle. I needed people who believed in something larger than themselves. Maya was already with me, though I did not realize how much until the night I broke down in front of her. We were in the lab at nearly 2 a.m. She was hunched over the centrifuge, her hair sticking up in every direction, while I sat staring blankly at the simulation on the screen. My hands would not stop trembling. She looked over, her eyes narrowing. "Eris, you cannot keep pushing like this. You look like you are about to collapse." I whispered. "If I collapse, the truth goes with me." She walked over, sat down beside me, and placed her hand firmly over mine. "Then we carry it together. You are not alone in this." Her words landed deep, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself lean into someone else's strength. She started staying late with me every night after that, not because she had to, but because she refused to let me drown alone. When I hesitated to share my father's notes, she told me, "You trusted me with ramen dinners at 3 a.m. and with crying on my shoulder when your experiments failed. You can trust me with this too." So I did. And when she saw the evidence for herself, her face went pale, but she nodded. "Then we fight, together." Evan was next, though with him it felt more like being hunted than recruited. He had a way of watching me like he could see straight through the shields I tried to put up. He showed up outside the institute one evening, leaning against a lamppost with his battered notebook tucked under his arm. "You have something you are not telling me," he said casually as I approached. I tried to brush him off, but he fell into step beside me. "I know the look, Eris. I have seen it in whistleblowers and people who carry truths so heavy they bend under it. You have that look." I stopped walking. "If I tell you, it will not just endanger me, it will endanger you too." He shrugged, though his eyes were serious. "Danger is the only language power understands, you know that." I studied him in the yellow glow of the streetlight. "If I let you in, you cannot walk away later." His mouth curved into the faintest smile. "I was in before you said a word." He kept pushing, and eventually I let him see the data. He went very still as he read, the only sound the scratch of his pen across his notebook. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady. "This is the story of a lifetime, but more than that, it is the story that will either save people or destroy them, depending on whether it gets told. And I want to be on the side that saves them." So Evan became part of the circle, not because I begged him, but because he refused to be kept out. Professor Adler was harder. He had lived through my father's fall from grace, and part of me resented him for not standing beside Elias when it mattered. But I also sensed something in him, a quiet guilt that weighed heavier than he ever admitted. One afternoon, I marched into his office with my findings tucked under my arm. He looked up, startled, as I dropped the folder on his desk. "What is this?" "Proof," I said. "That Helix Corp stole from my father again, and proof that their vaccine has a flaw that could kill people." His face tightened as he scanned the pages. He read in silence for what felt like forever, the only sound the creak of his old chair as he shifted. Finally, he set the folder down and removed his glasses. "Do you know what this means?" "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. "And I know what it cost my father when he tried to speak the truth. That is why I am asking for help." Adler rubbed his temples. Elias was brilliant, but he did not understand politics. He thought science would speak for itself. It never does. I leaned forward, desperate. "Then help me make it speak. Quietly, if you must. Just do not let me fight this alone." He stared at me for a long time, and in his eyes I saw the shadow of the man who had once admired my father. At last, he nodded slowly. "I cannot put myself on the front lines, Eris. But I can give you what resources I can find. Data access, maybe a contact or two. It will not be much, but it will be something." It was not the full-throated support I craved, but it was enough. Enough to know he had chosen not to stand in my way this time. Lena came unexpectedly. She was an engineer, always quiet, always practical, the kind of person people overlooked because she did her work so efficiently. One night, as she recalibrated the sequencer, she overheard Maya and me arguing. I had slammed my hand on the desk, shouting, "If they release this vaccine, it will be a massacre." Lena set down her tools and walked over, her expression calm but her voice firm. "I heard enough, and I am not stupid. I have seen their timeline. I know they are cutting corners. You are right, Eris, something is wrong." I tried to warn her off, but she just shook her head. "Do not bother. I do not need glory and I do not need recognition, but I will not stand by and watch people die. You need someone who knows the machines inside and out. You need someone who can cover your tracks when you dig where you should not. That someone is me." And just like that, Lena stepped into the circle. Jonas Reeve came last, introduced by Evan in a small cafe downtown. He was polished where the rest of us were raw, his suit pressed, his watch gleaming, his eyes sharp. He listened as Evan explained, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the table. Finally, Jonas turned to me. "If you want to fight Helix Corp, you need more than science. You need law, you need strategy, and you need allies who can stand on the world stage." I pushed my laptop toward him, my hands trembling slightly. He read in silence for several minutes, then looked up. "This is damning, but it is also dangerous. You need to decide whether you want to expose them for revenge or to save lives." I met his gaze, my voice low but steady. "I want to save lives, but I also want my father's truth to survive." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I am in, but we do this smart. No leaks, no reckless moves. We build the case brick by brick until it is unbreakable." And so the circle was complete, Maya with her fire, Evan with his pen, Adler with his quiet resources, Lena with her precision, Jonas with his strategy, and me, the daughter carrying the shadow of a man the world had erased. We began meeting in secret, sometimes in empty classrooms, sometimes in Evan's cluttered apartment, sometimes in corners of the lab after hours. We spread papers across tables, argued fiercely, challenged each other, comforted each other. Fear was always present, but so was determination. One night, as we pored over my father's notebooks, Maya whispered, "Do you ever feel like he is in the room with us?" I swallowed hard, my fingers tracing his handwriting. "Every second. He is the reason we are here, and he is the reason we will not stop." Evan scribbled furiously in his notebook, then looked up. "Then let us give him the ending he deserved." For the first time, I felt the crushing loneliness lift. For the first time, I believed we might actually have a chance. We were no longer just a handful of individuals. We were a circle. And together, we were ready to fight. Evan's apartment was not much to look at, but that night it became our war room. The place sat above a laundromat that never seemed to close, so the faint buzz of dryers mixed with the heavy smell of detergent drifting through the cracked window. Inside, the small living room was cluttered with stacks of newspapers, dog-eared notebooks, empty coffee cups, and the glow of a desk lamp that barely held the darkness at bay. The walls were covered with taped articles and scribbled notes, some connected with string like he was already building the conspiracy board of his life. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, clutching my father's journals against my chest. My throat was dry, my palms damp. It struck me that this was the first time I was letting all of them into one room, the first time my secret no longer belonged only to me. I felt naked and terrified, but also relieved. Maya breezed past me first, kicking off her boots and tossing her jacket onto Evan's couch. She collapsed into a chair, legs stretched out, hair tied up in a sloppy knot. If this is where the revolution begins, at least there is coffee. She lifted a mug from the table, sniffed, then grimaced. Cold. Figures. Evan smirked, already pouring fresh coffee into mismatched mugs. Revolutions are fueled by caffeine and bad decisions. Drink up. Lena slipped in quietly, almost invisible until she set her backpack down with a soft thud. She wore her usual jeans and hoodie, her dark hair tied back neatly, her expression calm. She moved like someone who preferred to stay in the background, but her eyes missed nothing. She gave me a small nod, as if to say, I am here, do not worry. Professor Adler arrived last, muttering about the broken lock on the front door and the risk of holding clandestine meetings in a place that smelled like bleach. He was out of place in the chaos, his gray suit wrinkled, his tie loosened. He lowered himself into a chair with a groan, rubbing his temples. I hope you all understand the magnitude of what you are doing. Once you cross this line, there is no going back. Jonas Reeve walked in behind him, immaculate as always in a perfectly tailored jacket and polished shoes that looked absurd on Evan's stained carpet. He carried a leather briefcase, which he set on the table with deliberate precision. Then, let us be sure the line is crossed in the right direction. His voice was calm, deep, the kind that made everyone else stop fidgeting. I looked at the group around me. 6 people in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet, plotting against a corporation that had more power than entire nations. My chest tightened, but when I opened my father's journals and spread them across the table, I felt a steadying strength rise inside me. Thank you for coming, I said quietly. I know what I am asking of you is dangerous. I know you could all walk away and protect yourselves, but I cannot. I found something in Helix Corp's vaccine research, something my father warned about years ago. If they release it, people will die. The room went still. Maya leaned forward, her voice sharp. Then the first question is simple. How do we stop them? Adler sighed heavily. You do not just stop a company like Helix Corp. They have the government behind them. They have the media. They have more lawyers than scientists. If you think shouting will bring them down, you are naive. Maya shot him a glare. So we sit on our hands and let people die? That is your plan? Jonas raised a hand, calm but firm. No one is suggesting doing nothing, but Adler is right. Charging out blindly will destroy you before you even get started. If you want to fight Helix Corp, you need strategy, you need layers of protection, and you need credibility that cannot be shaken. Evan was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his knee bouncing under the table. Credibility comes from the story. We show the world the data. We show them the flaw. We show them the stolen research. The people will see. Jonas shook his head. The people will see whatever Helix Corp pays for them to see. They will flood the media with counter-narratives. They will call you a fraud, Eris. They will call your father a fraud all over again. They will say this is revenge, not truth. If you want the world to listen, you cannot just reveal the problem. You must also reveal the solution. I looked down at my father's handwriting, the pages filled with his neat diagrams, his tired notes. My voice cracked when I spoke. He left it. He found the flaw, but he also found a way to fix it. He just never had the chance to finish testing before he died. I can finish it. I can prove it. Lena, who had been silent until now, spoke quietly. Then that is the plan. You prove the flaw, you prove the fix. I will keep the machines running and cover your tracks in the institute system. If anyone tries to trace where the data is being pulled from, I can scramble it. Maya smirked. See, I told you Lena is basically magic. Jonas leaned back, steepling his fingers. And while the scientists handle the science, I will begin drafting protections. We will place the intellectual property of Elia's Thorn into a trust under Eris's name. That way, when Helix Corp tries to claim ownership, there will be a legal wall already in place. They may still try to bury us, but it will not be as easy. Adler looked skeptical. You are assuming they will not find other ways to silence us. Helix Corp does not play fair. Evan snapped his notebook shut. Neither do we play smart. The story is not just that Helix Corp stole the research or that their vaccine is dangerous. The story is that there is hope they are hiding, a safer cure buried in the work of a man they destroyed. He turned to me, his eyes burning. That is the story that will move people. That is the story that will save lives. The argument went back and forth for hours. At times, voices rose, fists pounded the table, and for a moment I feared we would splinter before we even began. But then the energy shifted. We started finding common ground, shaping the chaos into something sharper. By the end of the night, we had our first map of action. Maya and I would continue the lab work, pushing the simulations until the flaw was undeniable and the fix was tested. Lena would manage the systems, ensuring our work could not be traced or erased. Adler would reach out to quiet allies in the scientific community, those who might lend their credibility when the time came. Jonas would prepare the legal shield, making sure the research was secured under my father's name. Evan would build the narrative, laying the foundation for the moment we were ready to go public. It was fragile, it was risky, but it was a start. When everyone finally left, the apartment was quieter than it had been in hours. Papers were scattered across the table, mugs half full, the faint sound of the laundromat below rumbling into the silence. I stayed behind, gathering my father's notebooks into my arms. Maya lingered by the door, her voice soft. "Do you feel any better?" I nodded, though my eyes stung. "For the first time, I do not feel like I am screaming into the void." She smiled faintly. "That is what friends are for." When I finally stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, the city glistening from a light rain. I stood there for a moment, clutching the journals to my chest, breathing in the smell of wet pavement and coffee clinging to my hair. For the first time in years, I did not feel completely alone. As I walked home, I thought of my father again. I thought of how often he had fought alone, how quickly his circle had abandoned him when the pressure mounted. And I knew in my heart that what we had built tonight was exactly what he had needed. A circle of allies, a team. I whispered into the night, "We will finish what you started, Dad." And for the first time, I believed we just might. The next days felt like the world outside was moving in fast forward while I was crawling through quicksand. Helix Corp filled every news cycle, their announcements growing bolder, their promises brighter. Reporters called it the dawn of a new age. Politicians called it salvation. People called it hope. And all I could see was the flaw pulsing like a heartbeat inside their vaccine, hidden beneath polished press releases. I buried myself in the lab with Maya. We sat side by side in the glow of computer monitors, simulations running endlessly, coffee cups piling higher with each passing hour. I traced protein structures on the screen until they danced behind my eyelids, until my body ached from sitting still too long. Each time the flaw appeared, my stomach clenched. It was there, undeniable, mocking us. But finding the flaw was only part of it. We needed to show the world where it came from. We needed to prove Helix Corp had built their so-called miracle on the bones of my father's stolen research. Maya leaned back in her chair one night, rubbing her eyes. "We are spinning in circles, Eris. We keep finding the same damn flaw over and over, but what if no one cares? What if people would rather believe the miracle?" Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they carried truth. I looked at her, my voice hoarse. "Then we make them care. We do not just show them the flaw, we show them the theft. We show them my father's work, and we prove that he saw the danger long before they pretended to solve it." She studied me, her face softening. "You really think his notes can stand up to them?" I opened the worn leather notebook on the desk, my father's handwriting looping across the yellowed pages. "This is not just notes, it is a roadmap, and if we follow it, the truth will stand." Evan became a fixture in the lab too, though he never touched the machines. He hovered with his notebook, scribbling furiously, asking questions that sometimes cut too close. "How did your father mark his sequences? What shorthand did he use? Can you show me where Helix Corp's data mirrors it exactly?" I would grit my teeth, but I answered. Each time I did, I felt like I was carving away another layer of my father's ghost, pulling him into the present for Evan's pen to capture. One night, after hours of combing through sequences, Evan pushed his notebook toward me. He had sketched a side-by-side comparison, one column with Helix Corp's data, the other with my father's notation from decades earlier. The resemblance was striking, undeniable. My chest tightened. He tapped the page with his pen. "This is it. This is how we prove the theft, not in abstract claims but in side-by-side evidence. Anyone can see the same signature here. It is like fingerprints." I swallowed hard, my throat aching. It feels like hearing his voice again. Evan's gaze softened. "Then let the world hear it too." Adler surprised me with how much he contributed once he decided to stop holding back. He slipped us articles from old journals, papers my father had submitted before his fall, drafts that had never been published but had somehow remained in Adler's archives. He muttered about confidentiality, about risk, but he still passed them across his desk with a grim nod. "If you are going to do this, do it thoroughly. Do not leave room for doubt." I clutched the papers, my hands trembling. Why are you helping me now? He sighed, his eyes clouded. Because I should have helped him then. Lena kept to the shadows, but her presence was steady. She would slip into the lab after hours, check the systems, make sure no one could track what we were doing. One night she pulled me aside. I found something strange in the network logs. Someone else has been digging too. My heart froze. What do you mean? She showed me lines of code, access attempts that did not match our team. They are watching. Maybe not us specifically, but they are sweeping the institute. We need to be more careful. Fear shot through me, cold and sharp. I whispered, "Do you think it is Helix Corp?" She shrugged, her face unreadable. Could be, or it could be someone they pay. Either way, it means we are not invisible. That night, I barely slept, lying awake with the image of Victor Haynes's smug smile flashing in my mind. I wondered if he already suspected, if he already had his claws out waiting for me to make one wrong move. Jonas kept reminding me that fear was a weapon Helix Corp counted on. He met me for coffee one morning, his suit impeccable even as my eyes were bloodshot. He stirred his espresso slowly, then leaned in. Listen carefully, Eris. Fear is their leverage. They want you to believe you are powerless so you never act, but you have something stronger than fear. You have the truth, do not forget that. I whispered. The truth did not save my father. Jonas's gaze sharpened. No, but your father was alone, you are not. His words stayed with me, circling in my head as I walked back to the lab. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe this time would be different because I was not screaming into the void by myself. I had a circle now. The deeper we dug, the clearer the picture became. My father had not only identified the flaw in the protein structure, he had already mapped out the path to correct it. His notes were incomplete, rough sketches more than finished solutions, but they pointed the way. Maya and I followed them like breadcrumbs, and to our astonishment, the simulations began to stabilize. Maya slapped the table one night, grinning despite the exhaustion in her eyes. He was right. He was always right. Look at this, Eris. His pathway works. If we refine it, we can fix the flaw completely. I stared at the screen, tears filling my eyes. For a moment, the lab around me faded, and I saw my father bent over his notes, his hand steady even when his body was frail. I heard his voice telling me that the truth always survives. I whispered, "We are finishing what you started, Dad." And for the first time, I believed we could. The outside world still praised Helix Corp as saviors. The news still ran stories about the miracle vaccine that was only weeks away. But inside our small circle, in late-night meetings and secret lab sessions, we were piecing together a different story. A truer story. A story that would show the world the theft, the flaw, and the solution. And every day we dug deeper, we came closer to holding proof that could not be denied. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the news. Just an envelope slipped under my office door. No name, no return address, only my own written in black ink across the front. My stomach tightened the moment I saw it. I stood there staring at it, heart thudding, before picking it up with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed across the center. Some doors should stay closed. I sat down hard in my chair, the room spinning around me. It was not signed, but it did not need to be. I knew who it was from, or at least I knew who had sent it. Helix Corp. Maybe not Victor Haynes himself, but someone in his army. They knew, or at the very least, they suspected. When Maya came in later, I handed her the paper without a word. She read it, her face going pale, then shoved it back at me. "Well, that is not ominous at all." I whispered, "They are watching us." She leaned close, her voice fierce. "Then let them, we are not stopping." But my hand still shook as I slipped the paper into my desk drawer. That same week, Evan showed up at the lab, more rattled than I had ever seen him. He tossed his notebook on the table and said, "Someone followed me last night. A black car. No plates. Every turn I made, they made." I had to duck into the subway just to lose them. My blood ran cold. "Evan, you cannot keep putting yourself in danger like this." He laughed bitterly. "Danger is part of the job, but it means we are close, Eris. They would not be watching us if they were not scared. Or," I said softly, "they are getting ready to crush us." He leaned across the table, eyes burning. "Then we hit them before they can. We do not flinch. We do not blink. We tell the story before they bury it." Jonas was more measured, though even he admitted the threats were real. We met in a quiet cafe again, but this time he kept glancing at the door, his jaw tight. "Helix Corp has ears everywhere," he said. "This is how they operate. Intimidation first, lawsuits second, and if that does not work, they ruin reputations until nothing you say matters." My throat was dry. "They ruined my father." Jonas nodded grimly. "And they will try to ruin you too. That is why we need airtight proof and airtight protection. No cracks they can exploit." Adler added his own warnings in his weary voice. Elias believed that truth would protect him. It did not. Do not make the same mistake. Be smarter than he was. His words cut deep because they carried both caution and regret. Lena was the one who kept us steady when fear threatened to swallow us. One evening, she showed us logs from the Institute's servers highlighting suspicious access attempts. They are trying to track us, but I have rerouted everything. As far as they can tell, the data is scattered. They cannot pin it on you directly. Maya gave her a look of awe. You are a lifesaver, Lena shrugged. I just know how to hide footprints, but we should assume they are already inside the building. We have to act like every move is being watched. The weight of it pressed down on me harder each day. I began noticing things I had once ignored. A man standing across the street from my apartment 2 nights in a row. Phone calls where no one spoke when I answered. An email that disappeared from my inbox before I could open it. Maybe I was paranoid. Or maybe I was finally seeing the shadow that had been hovering just outside my vision all along. One night I dreamed of my father. He was sitting at our old kitchen table, hunched over his notes, his hands trembling from the illness that ate away at him. He looked up at me with tired eyes and said, "They will come for you too, Eris, but do not let them take the truth." I woke up gasping, tears wet on my cheeks, my heart hammering. I lay there in the dark, listening to the city hum outside, whispering into the emptiness, "I will not let them." The circle grew tighter in response to the pressure. Our meetings at Evan's apartment turned more urgent. Jonas laid out legal strategies with brutal clarity. Maya and I worked through simulations until our eyes ached, confirming again and again that the flaw was real and that my father's pathway corrected it. Evan drafted articles but kept them locked away, waiting for the right moment. Adler funneled us old contacts quietly, though he warned us not to trust anyone too quickly. Lena guarded the digital side like a hawk, patching holes before HelixCorp could slip through. We argued more too. Tensions snapped across the table like sparks. Maya wanted to go public immediately, shouting the truth before HelixCorp's vaccine hit the market. Jonas argued that moving too soon would destroy us. Evan pressed for urgency, Adler counseled patience, and I sat torn between both sides. One night the shouting grew so loud that the laundromat downstairs banged on the ceiling. Maya slammed her fist on the table. Every day we wait, we gamble with people's lives. Jonas shot back, calm but sharp. Every day we rush, we gamble with our ability to be believed. Do you want the truth to be ignored? Do you want them to call Eris her father's delusional daughter? Because that is exactly what will happen if we do not prepare. I finally cut in, my voice shaking but firm. Stop! We cannot let them divide us before we even make a move. My father was destroyed because he stood alone. I will not let that happen to us. We move together, or we do not move at all. The room fell silent, the air thick. Then slowly heads nodded. The fight faded, replaced with grim determination. That was the night we agreed on the path forward. We would keep digging, keep building the evidence until it was impossible to deny. We would prepare both the exposure of the flaw and the unveiling of the fix, side by side. When the time came, we would go not just with fire but with water too, giving the world both the warning and the hope. As I walked home in the early hours of the morning, the streets eerily quiet, I could not shake the feeling that eyes followed me in the shadows. The threat had become real. HelixCorp knew we were close. The question now was not if they would try to stop us, but how far they would go. I held my father's notebook tighter against my chest, whispering into the night, "I will not let them erase you again." And for the first time, I understood the true cost of what we were about to do. The air in the lab grew heavier each day, like the walls themselves knew we were on borrowed time. News anchors grinned on every screen in the city, praising HelixCorp for their lightning speed, praising Victor Haynes as the man who would end the pandemic. Politicians lined up for photo ops, calling him a visionary. Families clung to hope like it was oxygen. And all the while, the flaw pulsed in the data like a warning siren only we could hear. Maya and I practically lived in the lab. We worked until our bodies begged us to stop, fueled by energy drinks and sheer desperation. Lena hovered in the background, her laptop always open, watching the system logs for intrusions. Evan came and went with his notebook, pressing for quotes, pressing for details, scribbling like he was racing against a deadline only he could see. Adler stopped by with old papers and quiet advice, never staying long. Jonas paced like a general preparing for war, reminding us at every turn that proof was our only shield. Then one night, after weeks of chasing simulations, Maya gasped. I spun toward her screen, heart hammering. The sequence we had been working on, the pathway my father had sketched years ago, stabilized. Perfectly. No collapse, no autoimmune cascade, just balance, just safety. Maya slapped the desk, her laughter breaking through the exhaustion. He did it, Eris. He saw it all along. Your father left us the key. I stared at the screen, tears burning my eyes. We finished it for him. My voice cracked. We actually finished it. For a moment, the lab was filled with something we had almost forgotten, hope. But hope is fragile. A week later, the betrayal came. It started small, a ripple beneath the surface. One morning, I logged into the Institute's servers and found a file missing. Not erased, just gone, like it had been lifted clean out of the system. My stomach dropped. I called Lena immediately. She rushed in, her face pale. I checked the logs. Someone bypassed my blocks. This was not just a random breach. They knew exactly what to take. Maya whispered, "Which file?" My voice shook. "The stabilized sequence." Silence, then anger. Maya cursed loudly, slamming her fist into the desk. "They have it. Helix Corp has it." Evan muttered, his pen scratching across the page, "And now they will parade it as their breakthrough." I sank into my chair, my whole body trembling. How? How did they even know where to look? The answer came faster than I wanted. That evening, Jonas arrived at our meeting late. His suit was immaculate as always, but his face was strained. He set his briefcase down, his voice clipped. "I need to tell you something. One of us is leaking." The room froze. Adler stiffened. "Leaking what?" "Information," Jonas said grimly. "To Helix Corp. They knew about your stabilized sequence before the ink was dry. That does not happen by accident. Someone in this circle is feeding them." Maya shot to her feet. "You think it is one of us, after everything?" Jonas's gaze was cold. "I do not think, I know, there is no other explanation." Arguments erupted around the table. Maya swore it could not be any of us. Evan demanded to know how Jonas was so certain. Adler shook his head, muttering that this was madness. Lena said nothing, her expression unreadable as she scrolled rapidly through her laptop. I sat in the middle of it all, my heart breaking. "Stop," I said finally, my voice cracking. "We cannot tear each other apart. That is exactly what they want." But deep down, I knew Jonas was right. Someone had betrayed us. The next day, Helix Corp held a press conference. Victor Haynes strode onto the stage in his perfect suit, smiling like the world's savior. Behind him, a slide lit up with a sequence I knew by heart, my father's pathway, our breakthrough. Victor announced it as their own discovery, a revolutionary fix that made their vaccine completely safe. Reporters cheered. Headlines exploded. The world called it a miracle. I sat frozen in the lab, watching it unfold on the screen, bile rising in my throat. Maya threw a mug against the wall, shattering it. Evan cursed under his breath, scribbling furiously. Adler closed his eyes, his face heavy with shame. Lena stared at her laptop, her jaw clenched. Jonas simply muttered, "So it begins." I whispered, "They stole him again. They stole my father again." Tears blurred my vision as Victor's smile filled the screen, the world applauding him for a theft so brazen it made my chest ache. For a moment I felt crushed, broken, like history was repeating itself exactly. But then I heard my father's voice in my head, steady and clear. "The truth survives." I wiped my face, my hands shaking but my voice firm. "No, this time they will not erase him. This time we fight back." The circle looked at me, and in their eyes I saw the same fire I felt burning in my chest. We had been betrayed, yes, but we were not finished. Helix Corp had stolen the breakthrough, but we still held the proof of the flaw. We still held the evidence of the theft, and we still had the truth. The press conference replayed on every screen in the city. Victor Haynes smiling under the bright lights, announcing their so-called breakthrough, waving his hands as if he had conjured salvation out of thin air. The reporters applauded, cameras flashed, and the world sighed with relief. I sat in the lab staring at the screen until my vision blurred, my chest aching like someone had carved a hole straight through me. Maya paced the room like a caged animal, muttering curses under her breath. "They took it. They took it right out of our hands. How do they keep getting away with this?" Evan sat slumped in a chair, scribbling furiously in his notebook, his jaw clenched. "They have the power. They own the narrative. But power does not make it true. The truth is still here." He tapped the notebook. "In your father's handwriting, in the data, in us." Adler leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face pale. "You do not understand how this game works. They have already won in the eyes of the public. Once the world believes, it is almost impossible to undo." Jonas straightened his tie, his voice calm but cutting. "Not impossible, just difficult. This is not about shouting louder. This is about precision. We expose the lie with proof so undeniable that even Helix Corp's billions cannot bury it." I sat in silence, my hands clutching my father's notebook. I flipped it open to the page with his shaky handwriting, the words that had guided us to the breakthrough. My throat tightened. He wrote this decades ago. He saw the flaw. He mapped the solution, and now Victor is claiming it as his own. My voice rose, shaking. I will not let them erase him again. I will not. The room stilled. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Maya dropped into a chair beside me, her hand firm on my shoulder. Then we do what they fear most. We shine a light. The next days became a blur of preparation. Jonas worked like a machine, drafting documents, piecing together the legal chain that tied the research back to my father. He filed for protections, for trusts, for anything that could shield the work from Helix Corp's claws. It will not stop them from trying, he warned, but it will make it harder for them to claim ownership. Adler dug deeper into his archives, pulling out forgotten drafts of my father's papers, old correspondence, anything that proved Elias Thorne had discovered the pathway years before Helix Corp existed. His hands shook as he handed me one worn folder. I kept these hidden, he admitted softly. I do not know why, maybe guilt, maybe fear, but they are yours now, use them. Maya and I kept running simulations, piling up evidence that the flaw was real, that my father's fix worked. Each successful run was another nail in Helix Corp's coffin, another piece of proof we could wield. Lena guarded it all, scattering the data across hidden servers, encrypting files, creating backups in places no one would think to look. She moved silently, efficiently, the unsung shield of our fragile truth. Evan drafted the article of his life. He read parts of it aloud to us in the apartment, his voice fierce. Helix Corp has built their empire on stolen science. They have taken the work of Elias Thorne, a man they destroyed, and paraded it as their own. But the truth cannot be buried forever. The truth is here in his notebooks, in the data, in the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. He looked up, eyes burning. This is not just science. This is justice. We argued over when to release it. Maya wanted to move immediately, to shout it from the rooftops before Helix Corp's vaccine hit the market. Jonas cautioned patience, warning that too soon would mean being crushed by counter-narratives. Adler urged careful timing, while Evan pressed for urgency. I sat in the middle, torn between fear and fire. Finally, I said, we do not wait until it is too late, but we do not go blind either. We move when we have everything in place, when the world cannot ignore us. Jonas nodded. Then we prepare for war. The war began sooner than we expected. One evening, as I was leaving the lab, a man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a dark suit, his smile sharp. Dr. Thorne, he said smoothly. A word of advice, stop digging. It would be a shame if you ended up like your father. Cold fear sliced through me, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. My father was right, and so am I, his smile widened. That is what he thought too. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. I stumbled home, my hands shaking, my chest tight. I wanted to curl into myself, to hide, to vanish. But when I opened my father's notebook again, when I traced his handwriting with trembling fingers, the fear turned to fire. I whispered, you tried to silence him. You will not silence me. The next morning, I walked into Evan's apartment with the notebook in my hands. I laid it on the table, my voice steady. We are ready. We are going to show the world. Maya grinned, fierce and tired. About damn time. Evan picked up his pen. Jonas opened his briefcase. Adler sighed but nodded. Lena adjusted her laptop. The circle leaned in together, united. We were done hiding. It was time to expose the lies. The morning we chose to go public, the sky over the city was a flat gray, heavy with clouds that looked like they wanted to swallow the skyline whole. I stood by my apartment window, clutching my father's notebook in my hands, watching the streets below slowly come alive. People hurried with masks on their faces, their eyes tired, their movements stiff. They were waiting for salvation, waiting for the vaccine that Helix Corp promised would change everything. And I was about to tell them that the salvation was a lie. My hands shook as I slipped the notebook into my bag. I whispered to the empty room, stay with me, Dad, I need you. Then I left for Evan's apartment, the place we had chosen as our command center. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tense energy. Papers and laptops littered the table, coffee cups lined the counter like soldiers ready for battle. Maya sat hunched over a computer, her hair messy, eyes burning with determination. Lena typed furiously on her laptop, the glow reflecting in her glasses. Adler stood by the window, arms crossed, silent but steady. Jonas paced with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low tones to someone at the World Health Organization. Evan sat in the middle of it all, notebook open, pen ready. When I walked in, everyone turned. For a moment the room went quiet. Then Evan said softly, "Are you ready?" I swallowed hard. I do not know if I will ever be ready, but I know we cannot wait any longer. Jonas hung up his phone, his expression sharp. Who will not officially back you yet? They want more data, more time, but they are listening. That is more than we had yesterday. Maya rolled her eyes. More time? People do not have more time. Helix Corp is about to roll this vaccine out like candy. Lena glanced up. Then we hit publish today. We make enough noise that no one can ignore it. Evan tapped his pen against the notebook. The article is ready. Once we release it, it will spread like wildfire, but be prepared. They will hit back hard and fast. My chest tightened, but I nodded. Let them. We are not backing down. We gathered around as Evan prepared to send the article. He read the headline aloud one last time. The Stolen Cure, How Helix Corp Built a Miracle on the Work of Elias Thorne. My breath caught at hearing my father's name spoken with dignity instead of scorn. Do it, I whispered. Evan clicked. The article went live. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, calls, threats. Social media exploded. Some people called me a hero, others called me a liar. Hashtags trended, debates raged, news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Pictures of my father appeared online, old photos dredged from archives, his face suddenly everywhere. For years he had been erased, and now his name was on every tongue. But Helix Corp struck back quickly. Within hours, they released statements calling the article false, calling me unstable, calling my father a disgraced scientist whose work had been discredited decades ago. Victor Haynes appeared on television, calm and smiling, dismissing me as the bitter daughter of a failed man. He said their vaccine was safe, revolutionary, flawless. He called our claims desperate lies. Maya threw a shoe at the screen. That smug bastard. Evan cursed under his breath, scribbling notes. He came prepared. He knew this was coming. Jonas remained calm, adjusting his tie. Let him talk. The louder he denies, the more the cracks show. We have the data, we have the proof, and we are not backing down. Adler finally spoke, his voice low. This is where it gets dangerous. They will not stop at words. He was right. That night, as I left the institute, a car followed me again. This time it did not back off when I turned. It stayed on my tail until I ducked into a crowded diner, heart pounding. I sat at the counter with shaking hands, pretending to drink coffee until the car finally disappeared. I called Maya from the bathroom, my voice trembling. They are not just watching anymore, they are hunting. Her voice was fierce. Then we hunt back. You are not alone, Eris, remember that. When I returned to Evan's apartment, exhausted and rattled, the circle was waiting. Jonas laid out the next steps, release more data, more comparisons, more undeniable proof. Adler would call in favors with old colleagues, pushing them to publicly support us. Lena would guard our systems with everything she had. Evan would keep the story alive in the press. Maya and I would keep the science airtight. As the plan took shape, I felt the fear in my chest settle into something else. Resolve. I opened my father's notebook and placed it in the center of the table. This is not just about me. This is not just about him. This is about millions of people who trust Helix Corp with their lives. We cannot let them walk blindly into disaster. Whatever it costs, we see this through. The circle leaned closer, united. Maya's eyes burned, Evan's pen hovered, Adler's face tightened with resolve, Lena's fingers flew across her keyboard, Jonas's voice cut sharp and steady. We had gone public. We had lit the fire, and now the storm was coming. But for the first time, I did not feel crushed by it. For the first time, I felt ready to face it. The article was only the beginning. Once Evan hit publish, once my father's name returned to the world, the battle spread far beyond us. It was no longer just one small circle against Helix Corp. It was headlines, interviews, panels, and endless waves of anger and disbelief rolling across the globe. The first days were chaos. News anchors debated on live television, some calling me brave, others calling me delusional. Scientists chimed in on both sides, some insisting the flaw was real, others dismissing it as paranoia. Protesters gathered outside Helix Corp headquarters in New York holding signs that read "The truth survives" and "Justice for Elias Thorne." At the same time, supporters of Helix Corp flooded the streets chanting Victor Haynes's name. The world was dividing, and I was standing at the fault line. I did my first interview on a small independent channel. The host's eyes were kind but skeptical as she asked, "Dr. Thorne, why should people believe you over the most powerful pharmaceutical company in the world?" My throat was dry, but I steadied my voice. Because this is not about power. It is about evidence. My father identified the flaw decades ago. His notes show it. Our simulations prove it. Helix Corp's so-called miracle is built on stolen work, and it is unstable. I am not asking people to believe me. I am asking them to look at the data. The interview went viral. My inbox filled with messages from strangers, some thanking me, others threatening me. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for either hope or hate. Inside the circle, the pressure mounted. Maya kept running simulations, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We need to show them everything," she insisted. "Every line of code, every result. Overwhelm them with proof until they cannot deny it." Lena worked around the clock, guarding our servers, setting up hidden backups in case Helix Corp tried to erase us digitally. "They are probing harder," she warned one night, her eyes red from staring at code. "They want to wipe us clean, but I am not letting them." Evan published follow-up pieces daily, each one sharper than the last. He compared Helix Corp's sequences to my father's notes side by side, the resemblance undeniable. He interviewed other scientists, some too afraid to speak publicly, their voices altered, faces blurred. His articles lit sparks that turned into flames across the internet. Adler reached out to colleagues quietly, calling in favors, pushing for letters of support. Some answered cautiously, their reputations too fragile to risk. Others stayed silent, afraid. I saw the shame in Adler's eyes each time someone refused. "They fear the same thing I once feared," he admitted softly. "Losing everything." But fear cannot win this time. Jonas maneuvered in the shadows of law and politics. He drafted petitions, filed claims, spoke in private meetings with people who had influence. One evening, he returned to Evan's apartment with a rare smile. "The World Health Organization has agreed to review the data. It is not an endorsement yet, but it is a door opening." That night, we celebrated with cheap takeout and too much coffee. For a few hours, laughter filled the room, the weight lifted just enough for us to breathe. Maya teased Lena about living in code, Evan argued with Jonas about wording in the articles, Adler told a rare story about my father cracking jokes at conferences. I sat back, watching them, my chest warm. This was what he had needed all those years ago. A circle, a family, a shield, but Helix Corp did not sit idle. Their counterattack came swift and brutal. They flooded the media with ads painting me as unstable, dragging up old stories about my father's downfall, calling him a fraud and me a bitter daughter trying to reclaim his lost glory. Victor appeared on every major network, his smile unwavering, his voice calm. "Our vaccine is safe. Dr. Thorne is exploiting her father's discredited work to sow doubt in a time when the world needs hope. We will not be distracted." Maya shouted at the television. "Discredited my ass? He stole everything." But I felt the sting of his words. The doubt they planted in the world, even in me. For a moment I feared history was repeating itself exactly, that the world would choose to believe the savior in a suit over the daughter of a man they had erased. Then the emails began, not from strangers but from scientists around the globe. Quiet messages that said, "I have seen the flaw too. I ran my own tests and you are right. They cannot silence us all." Each message was a spark, and together they became a fire. Soon, petitions circled demanding independent review of Helix Corp's vaccine. Journalists in Europe and Asia picked up Evan's articles, spreading them across languages. Protests grew louder. WHO officials announced a formal investigation. The world was no longer divided between Helix Corp and one grieving daughter. The world was becoming a battlefield of truth, and I knew then that the fight was bigger than me, bigger than my father, bigger than any of us. It was about millions of people whose lives hung in the balance. It was about whether truth could survive against power. As I stood before the circle one night, my father's notebook open on the table, I said softly, "This is the battle he could not win. But we will. Not because we are stronger, but because we are not alone." They nodded, one by one. Maya with fire in her eyes, Evan with his pen poised, Adler with quiet resolve, Lena with her steady hands, Jonas with his sharp mind. The storm had become global. The lies had been exposed. Now it was a war for the soul of truth itself. The days leading to the final stand felt unreal, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Every screen, every radio, every newspaper spoke of the battle between Helix Corp and the truth. The World Health Organization announced they would hold an emergency session to review the evidence. The world watched as if waiting for a verdict in a trial that would decide the fate of millions. I barely slept. My dreams were filled with my father's voice, sometimes clear, sometimes fading, always whispering the same words, "Do not let them erase me again." On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, clutching his notebook. My reflection looked like a stranger, dark circles under my eyes, shoulders tense, hair pulled back too tightly. But in my eyes, I saw him. I whispered, "We will finish this together." When I arrived at the WHO auditorium, the others were already waiting. Maya was in a navy suit, trying to look professional but still fidgeting with her sleeves. Evan carried his battered notebook like a weapon. Adler stood stiffly, his face pale but determined. Lena had her laptop open even in the lobby, fingers flying across the keys. Jonas was calm as ever, his tie perfect, his expression unreadable. We entered together. The room was massive, filled with representatives from dozens of nations, journalists lining the walls, cameras flashing. At the far end of the hall sat the panel of WHO officials, their faces serious. And at another table, across from ours, sat Victor Haynes and his entourage of polished executives and lawyers. He looked at me and smiled, calm and confident as if this was already won. Jonas leaned close and whispered, "Remember, do not let him get under your skin. Speak the truth, that is all." The session began. Victor was given the floor first. He rose smoothly, adjusting his suit, and spoke with the charm that had won the world. He painted a picture of hope, of salvation, of science conquering despair. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, calling me a grieving daughter clinging to her father's failed work. He said Helix Corp's vaccine was flawless, revolutionary, safe. He promised the world healing. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. For a moment, my stomach twisted with fear. Then it was my turn. I stood, my father's notebook in my hands, and walked to the podium. My voice shook at first, but then steadied as I looked out at the sea of faces. My father, Elias Thorne, was once a scientist like any of you. He discovered a pathway that revealed both the promise and the danger of genetic vaccine models. He warned of a flaw, a structural instability that could trigger autoimmune collapse months after injection. He mapped the beginnings of a solution. But his work was stolen, his name erased, his warnings buried. I opened the notebook and held it up. These are his words, his diagrams, his discovery, and this, I gestured to the screens where our simulations appeared, is the proof. The flaw exists. Helix Corp built their vaccine on it. If released as it is, it will not save lives, it will destroy them. The room shifted, murmurs rising. Maya stepped forward, her voice fierce. We ran the simulations again and again. The flaw is real. The fix is here. It is not just theory. It works. Evan read aloud from his articles, showing the side-by-side comparisons between Helix Corp's data and my father's notes. Lena displayed encrypted files and server logs proving our discovery came before Helix Corp's sudden breakthrough. Adler testified to my father's brilliance, his voice heavy with guilt. Jonas laid out the legal trail, the protections, the undeniable theft. Together, we built the case brick by brick, truth layered upon truth until the weight of it filled the room. Victor tried to laugh it off, tried to smear me again, but his smile faltered as the evidence piled higher. He raised his voice, he accused, but each time Jonas calmly dismantled his claims. Each time Maya countered with data. Each time Evan reminded the room of the story, of the human cost. And then something shifted. A scientist from the panel leaned forward and said, "I have run my own tests. Dr. Thorne is correct. The flaw exists." Another stood and added, "I too have seen the instability." The murmurs grew louder, this time not with doubt, but with realization. By the end of the session, the verdict was clear. WHO announced they would suspend Helix Corp's vaccine pending independent review. They announced they would work with our team to refine the safer pathway my father had mapped, to release it freely to the world. The room erupted. Some cheered, some argued, reporters shouted questions. Victor sat stone-faced, his empire cracking around him. I stood frozen, tears streaming down my face. Maya hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Evan grinned through his exhaustion. Adler's shoulders sagged with relief. Lena actually smiled, small but real. Jonas simply nodded, his calm mask finally breaking into satisfaction. When the cameras turned to me, I spoke into the sea of microphones, my voice clear. This is not about revenge. This is not about power. This is about truth. My father's work was stolen, but today we give it back to the world. Not for profit, not for glory, but for life. Science should not belong to corporations. It should belong to humanity. The words echoed across the room, carried out into the world. That night, as I walked home under the city lights, I felt the weight on my chest finally lift. I pulled out my father's notebook and whispered, "We did it, Dad. We finished it." I could almost hear his voice in the wind, soft and proud. The truth had survived, and it had saved millions.